In most U.S. history programs, instruction typically starts off with the Plymouth colonists who landed in Massachusetts in the fall of 1620. I have to admit that as a professor, I too often start with the folks who made Plymouth Rock their home. This is probably because the Plymouth settlers wrote the Mayflower Compact, the first governing document penned in the New World. Their motives were not centered on wealth and other worldly items, so beginning with the 102 passengers who carried their meager belongings with them on the Mayflower is a good place to start on a tour of American history. Still, arriving in Massachusetts was a mistake in the eyes of the planners. In truth, the Pilgrims were actually looking for a more southerly location or place in the Virginia colony. Some 13 years earlier, a group of about 104 Englishmen and boys who called themselves the Virginia Company settled at a swampy place on a peninsula in the James River near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Those adventurers left England in December 1606 and landed on the swampy peninsula on May 13, 1607. They made their transatlantic voyage in 3 ships, the Godspeed, the Susan Constant, and the Discovery. When they arrived, the Virginia Company named a governing council that included Captain Christopher Newport, who captained one of the ships, and a former mercenary named Captain John Smith. While the Pilgrims were looking for a place to build a truly Christian community, we have to ask what motivated the members of the Virginia Company. Did they make their perilous journey in pursuit of God or material wealth? We also have to ask what crises or horrors did their narrow set of goals create for them? Today on The Vantage Point, we're going to take a shot at answering those questions. I hope you'll join me. The settling of the Jamestown colony was not the first attempt of interested parties from England to establish a colony in the New World. By 1607, the English were playing catch-up to the Spanish, who were way ahead of the English in tapping into the seemingly vast reserves of valuable resources in the New World. By the way, the name America is derived from an Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, who early in the 16th century proposed the revolutionary idea that the lands visited by Columbus in 1492 were part of a new continent. As more ships followed Columbus's route, the name America stuck to the new lands. It first appeared on maps published in 1507. England's first attempt at colonizing America occurred in 1585 when Governor John White landed a party of between 111 and 121 people on a spit island off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. The island and colony were named Roanoke. A wee baby named Virginia Dare was the first person born to English parentage in the New World. Her birth made the fate of the colonists an even sadder one. We know about her existence because John White, who was the governor of the colony, and her grandfather, returned to England to get supplies. His planned return to America was held up for the next few years as England was consumed with fighting the Spanish. Of notable distinction, in 1588, England's small but quick fleet of ships defeated the much larger and slower ships that made up the formidable Spanish Armada. At any rate, when Governor White returned to Roanoke in 1590, there was no sign of the colonists. Today, we remember Virginia Dare and her community as the lost colonists of Roanoke. On a positive note, the county in which the colony was established was named after the little girl, Dare County, North Carolina. In 1606, there was a great deal of hope in the halls of Westminster for the Virginia Company. The company's mission was to find gold and silver and a route to the Pacific. A passage to the Pacific and the rich spice markets of Asia will continue to be an objective of explorers for more than a century. That objective suggests, to me anyway, that some of the settlers would have possessed skills to hunt and trap. But this was a novel world with new animals, plants, and people who were not too keen to have permanent visitors, if you know what I mean. Imagine how different England was from the James River area in the early 17th century. In England, hunting was a noble activity, but the Virginia Company was made up of non-nobles that included some woodworkers. Even still, there were few prey species to hunt in southern England beyond a fox, deer, or rabbit. Parasitic insects are also rare in England, as well as the rarity of poisonous snakes. In fact, only the adder, Vipera berus, carries venom, but it's not aggressive, and it's hard to find even if one is looking for a specimen. In southern England, bears and wolves only lived in children's stories. Most of the settlers were adventurers from large villages or cities, so they had little knowledge of farming. They were also not prepared for mosquitoes, water moccasins, copperheads, rattlesnakes, bears, bobcats, panthers, and the pathogens that lived in the water. The colony was set up for some obvious serious problems, especially after two of their leaders returned to England. It took about a month to construct a fort, so when that major task was completed, Captain John Smith and Captain Christopher Newport left for England on June 22, 1607. Through Smith, some provisions for trade were made with the local Powhatans, an Algonquin people who formed a loose confederacy that stretched to Ohio and even into Canada. As weeks turned into months and the colonists failed to cultivate a crop or successfully hunt in the swampy, mosquito-infested lands, their ability to trade with the Powhatans grew worse. By the fall of 1609, and with no return ships carrying needed supplies on the horizon, the colonists were in for what has become known as the starving time. You might not know this factoid, but the colonization of America occurred during a climatic period called the Little Ice Age. Consequently, the weather was not always predictable or favorable. There was a protracted drought in the summer of 1609 that made the Powhatans virtually stop providing food to the colonists. They had to feed their own people. There had already been deaths among the settlers due to typhoid and dysentery that they contracted from drinking contaminated swamp water. According to George Percy, John Smith's successor, and I quote, "And now famine, beginning to look ghastly and pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and to eat them, and some have licked up the blood which hath fallen from their weak fellows." End of quote. Despite resorting to cannibalism, an estimated 80 to 90% of the original settlers were dead when the spring arrived. The warming weather brought two ships with about 110 colonists on board. More importantly, the survivors, the ships brought badly needed supplies. One of the newly arriving settlers in 1610 was a man named John Rolfe. Rolfe had spent some time in the West Indies where he acquired tobacco seeds. He busied himself with experimenting with the plants, and by 1619 tobacco was being shipped to England. Rolfe also married Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's daughter, who had in 1607 successfully argued to save the life of John Smith. 1619 was also the year in which African slaves first arrived in Virginia. Among the 50 slaves were men, women, and children. Sadly, that would not be the last shipment of human cargo to arrive in the American colonies. The importation of slaves, however, became illegal on January 1st, 1808. The wealth motive did not die with the Jamestown colony. Jamestown began with horrific and deadly consequences that should have scared off new settlers if information had traveled faster across the ocean. Perhaps it would have spelled doom to future colonial ventures, but Providence had other plans. Nonetheless, the Plymouth colonists were certainly motivated by spiritual matters more than they were wealth. Clearly, they were interested in living bountiful lives. But their motives were far more noble than those of the planters who would turn Virginia, the land of the Virgin Queen, into a place where the peculiar institution of slavery would, along with the tobacco plants of John Rolfe, take root and form a cancer that would nearly kill the fledgling country in the 1860s. Well, I hope you got something out of today's show. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. God bless you and yours, and I'll see you next time here on The Vantage Point.